Okay, so drawing the portrait. What I like to do is in Procreate, I'll use the round brush and I'll have my opacity basically all the way up. My brush size about that big. And what I'll do, say when just starting the figure, at least from profile view, what I like to do is go in, I'll start putting this like little smiley face line. This is going to represent the chin. I'll go in, I'll put two lines kind of going upwards. Two more lines. And I'm going to try to keep things very simple. This is going to be the top of the skull. Since, skulls are round. This gives me an idea of where everything is going to be for a later date. I like to start with the chin because I feel like it gives me like a good center of where the rest of everything else is going to be. What I'll do then is I'll put a line almost about 2/3 of the way through. This is going to be my brow line. What I do next is I'll go ahead and I'll put in the neck. Now, you don't want the neck to be too big for the head. Like maybe if like you're drawing a character with a different build and they'll have like really broad shoulders, you can go ahead and go all out, draw a super thick neck, just go to town with it. For this, we're just going to kind of keep it simple. I like to think of this as a cone almost. So this is in my mind how I'm visualizing it. And the head's just sitting on top of this, like, or not a cone, excuse me, but a cylinder. And the head's just sitting on top of this cylinder, just, resting on it. Go clean this up a little bit. So what I'll do next, actually, once I have my cylinder established, I'll go ahead and I'll start working in on the shoulders. So two things, when you're drawing something, it's always good to kind of move your screen around to kind of adjust to where your hand is. Say if you're like you're left-handed, you can move the screen around a little bit to like or the paper for this instance, over to your left side so you can get a better angle on how you're drawing something. Of course, that could lead to things not being straight, but it it can definitely help you get a different perspective on what you're drawing. For this, what I like to do is not only practice moving the screen around, but I'll also practice like drawing at different like paper or pencil weights. So it's good to practice between going from anywhere between light to darker and dark, because that'll help you kind of like figure out, or that'll kind of like drawing lighter will actually help you remedy mistakes. Because if you don't draw so hard on the paper, it's going to be easier to erase things. And also drawing lightly also can look really nice in certain parts of your drawing. It's good to use both weights, light and dark, to kind of give more of a weight, which we'll get into a little bit later, actually. I'm jumping the gun. So what I'd like to do is have this be about like 2.5-ish heads wide. Once I kind of have that established, I'll go ahead and I'll make this like rhombus shape. It's about a head and a half down. And I'll go in and I'll make this other rhombus shape. I'll make it almost like the same like distance as this top one right here. Maybe a little bit wider, a little bit shorter. You can really play around with it depending on how you want your character to look. Basically what these are right here are the hips. And the rhombus up here is going to be the torso, the shoulders, the ribs, the chest. All that's just kind of being like generalized up in these two areas. What you can do next is kind of like pull out the pelvis line. I like to put this little like line right here to emphasize where the thigh gap is going to be. Then I'll pull out, almost make it like a triangle in a way. Once I have that established, I can now kind of figure out like where I'm going to put like my thighs, the belly button. This kind of just gives me a guideline of where things can go from there. So for when it comes to like the thighs that you're going to draw, try to make them like cones almost. It's a pretty wide thigh gap, but so basically, once you have those established, what I like to do is to make sure that the calves and the thighs are about the same length and size. I'll go ahead and I'll make it's like rhombus almost right here after I'm done with the thigh. What this is right here basically is where the knees would go. And then I'll go ahead and I'll make another rhombus roughly about the same size as the thighs. There you go. I'm just cleaning it up a little bit. Okay, so now we have our thighs, we have our legs. One thing to note is when you're drawing something, you don't want to stay zoomed in to something the entire time. Maybe when you're doing a finer detail, but you got to make sure you zoom in, then out, then in and out, just to kind of make sure like things are lining up how you think they're lining up. Because you could stay focused into something like this, and then when you zoom out, you're like, oh wow, like that doesn't look like anything like I thought it was going to look like. Moving on, for feet, what I like to do is, you guessed it, more rhombuses. Rhombuses will save your life. And just kind of like having those there will kind of like help me figure out like where I'm going to put the base of the foot, like where I'm going to put the ankles. Like say this like little part right here that connects. You can draw these like two like little like side curves to kind of emphasize where the ankles are going to be. And for the toes, I like to draw a little rhombus right here to kind of give me an idea of where the toes are going to be on the foot. It also kind of helps with perspective as well. But it's really good guideline of like figuring out where you're going to put the little toes. So from here, we can actually go back to the top and start working on those shoulders. So I'll put these two like adjacent lines roughly up here. For shoulders, I'll try to keep them almost like triangular when I'm first drawing them. It just gives me a better understanding of where they're going to go on the body. Because these little adjacent lines right here that I just drew, like these ones, these are where the armpits are going to go. I'll draw these like triangles. And then for arms, I'm going to treat them the same way as I treated the thighs and the calves. The only difference is that when you're drawing the bicep, essentially, like this little part right here that I'm on, the biceps are usually shorter than the forearms. And you want the forearms to come down almost to like your character's sides. So your forearms, think of them like a bicep and some change, really. And then once I establish the forearm, I'll draw this little line right here to emphasize that's where the wrist is going to go. Let's go ahead and do the same over here. And once I clean this up, it's going to make more sense. Oh, that is like incredibly short. The good thing about using like applications is that if you make an oopsie, you can always just go back and just undo it. Okay, so we have a lot of the parts in our figure established. When it comes to the hands, you can make like a cone kind of like shape, or maybe more like a rhombus actually. Like a curvy rhombus. Basically, this is like where the palm of the hand's gonna go. Once you have those down, when it comes to the fingers, I find it best to kind of just block things in as opposed to trying to figure out where each individual item's gonna be. So for your index finger, you can just kind of like block in a little bit. And you're like, oh man, like where do the other fingers go? And then you can have your pointer finger come out. Granted, these are some long fingers. And then kind of like block in the rest of them to kind of like match that. Let me shorten this a little bit. And then for your thumb, I like to draw this like really like this triangle kind of close to like where the wrist is. Then I'll put the thumb right next to it. Let me clean that up a little bit. Bada bing, bada boom. You got yourself a hand right there. Now, right now, our character is like really looking like a mannequin. Um, Essentially, what you want to end up doing is you can go back in and make objects softer, and you can do that by adding curves to it. Since the human body isn't really blocky, it's a lot curvier. You could say this is where your knowledge of the human body would come in. Like, you don't have to know necessarily where everything is. Like, you don't have to be like an expert in anatomy to kind of understand like where everything's going to go. I will say it helps for sure. Like, it definitely helps, but I don't think it's everything. So all I'm doing right now is I'm going back in things that I feel like look too boxy. I'll go back in, I'll add curves to them to kind of make things look softer. If I feel like an object needs to be a little skinnier, I'll go back in and I'll do that as well. But because I have so many like boxed in things already, I've already established for the most part like where everything's going to go. Oh, one more actual added thing before I forget is you want to make sure your character has shoulders. So not just these right here, but how they go into the neck as well. So your shoulders actually go right into your neck. Or because you do have back muscles. Usually once I establish this, I can kind of figure out like for these triangles that we drew earlier, you can kind of tell like, okay, they're kind of big right now and they look more like shoulder pads than shoulders. For these, what I actually like to do is now that I have everything established, like with the neck, the shoulders right here, I'll go back in and if I feel like I need to make them shorter, I will. Because I know now that they belong in that area. I'll go back in, I'll make them shorter to kind of like match where the biceps are going to be. And where the rest of the arm's going to be. And now, I have my little armpits right here. So all I did was using these lines right here, you can draw a little like curvy circle right here to kind of emphasize like the armpits. When you make them more rounder like that, it makes it feel more alive. Like there's flesh that might be like folded underneath there. Oh, it sounds so gross. Flesh. And going back in and just giving it this treatment of making things more rounder. I feel like it makes things feel like it pops from the page a little bit more. Now, you don't have to have like the feet this wide like how I did. This is kind of like an awkward stance. You can make them closer, you can make them shorter, but I feel like once you have this pelvic bone right here kind of established, you can really do anything you want. The goal here is to not make everything like perfect when you're drawing a figure like this. The goal is to just make sure like things are in place where you want them to be, and then once you have that taken care of, you can just go back and then you can kind of like make things how you want them to look. So now that we have this line up here, let's actually talk about facial features. I feel like this line right here kind of helps me define where everything else is going to go. Essentially, what I like to do is put a little triangle right here. Now, it's not straight, but I think you get the idea. This right here is actually the brow line. I'll go back in, excuse me, and I'll put these two little curves right here. Kind of erase my triangle to emphasize where I'm going to put the nose. Having this kind of gives me an idea of where I'm going to put my eyeballs, where I'm going to put my nose, the rest of the nose, where I'm going to put the lips. I feel like establishing these first helps me understand where everything else is going to go. And when I draw the eyes, I like to make them about 3 eyes, one eye apart between each other. And I'll have them like half an eye away from the head, or the sides of the head, excuse me. And I'll go in and I'll make this frowny face almost for the top of the eyelid. And I like to make this like the darker eyelid. And for underneath, I'll kind of like gesture around the rest of the oval almost in a smiley face like fashion. Everything kind of like leaning towards the right for this side, and then giving it that same treatment for this side. Everything leaning over to like the left this time though. And I'll make this dark. Zoom out, see, got myself some eyelids. All right. And then for the nose, actually, I'll go about midway to the face. And I'll put this triangle right here. Once I have that established, I'll put this smaller triangle underneath it. Just to kind of give me an idea of where the nose is going to go. And we're going to come back to that in just a second. So what I'll do is I'll come back, I'll kind of like clean this up a little bit. Ooh, there we go. Yeah, clean it up. Because we don't really need that too much anymore. Now that we have like our eyes established, the top of our nose established, we don't really need the brow line right there. I feel like it's just kind of going to get in the way. So you can start erasing some stuff. I'll go back in and give my character some eyelids a little bit. So I'll just kind of like gesture that something's there. I won't draw the full eyelid out. And then I'll go underneath and kind of gesture that there's an eyelid right there as well. When it comes to making eyeballs, There's many different ways you can go about it, but I like to kind of stick to more like circular kind of idea. I'll go in. I made my pen a little bit bigger, and I'll kind of just like put it in a circle, essentially. I'll try to do the same thing for this side as well. It's about where I want it. You don't have to make it like super blocky like how I did, but this is just like my little like cheat way to do it. And I'll go back in and I'll erase like a small little circle out of the circle that I just drew to give it some life. You can even essentially go back in later on and you can play with the eyelashes, kind of like make them thicker, make them smaller. You can change the eye shape. I feel like as long as they retain that oval shape, essentially, that sideways oval shape that we first drew before we actually put any of the details in, as long as they retain that shape and people know it's an eyeball, you can really do whatever you want with it. Once we have that, and since we have the nose lines now, you can actually go to the sides. And I like to put these little lines here. You don't have to keep them, but essentially they kind of help me figure out where I'm going to put my eyebrows. So by having these, I feel like I understand the shape more so of the brow. And I'll go in, I'll make the front part of the eyebrow a lot darker. And then as it gets closer to this brow right here, essentially, it gets lighter. So it'll be thicker on the front end when it's closer to like the nose. And then it'll get lighter as it gets closer to the brow. And you can erase those if you want. You don't have to keep them. But I feel like that just kind of helps me understand if I can't figure it out myself. Then we can just go back. So now that we're done with the eyes right here, we can go back in. We can start playing with the nose a little bit. What I'll do is I'll come in, I'll make these little lines right here inside the smaller triangle. And then I'll go back in. Essentially, it's just a series of curves, if you will. So the upper triangle is actually the top of the nose, and then the bottom is, of course, underneath it. When you have the nose established, it'll be easier to figure out where the mouth is going to go. If you do end up having troubles with figuring out like where the mouth and the relationship to the chin, sometimes what I'll end up doing actually is I'll make this like rhombus like shape almost. I'll go from about midway, if not to the top of the cheeks where the eyes are, and draw this line kind of like where the rhombus is. And this kind of like in the center of that line, usually the lower lip will be around this, and then you'll have like the rest of this being like your chin essentially. So once I have all these, I'll go in and I'll draw a line in the center, just like this. What I'll do next is I'll put like a little V. We got some curves. And this is the seam in between the lips. So it's not a lip in particular, but it is the seam like that goes in between the two of the lips. So what I'll draw next is I'll put these dots on the sides of the mouth. And then I'll go ahead and I'll draw the upper lip. Kind of like close my shape. And now you're free to draw the bottom lip actually. I don't really like to close the bottom lip. I feel like as a style choice, I'll leave it open. And really, you can follow this trend with like both male and female characters. Just know that when you draw more male masculine characters, you want to make things more like a little bit more boxy instead of like softer. When you draw stuff like rounder and stuff, I feel like it makes it look a little bit more feminine. For ears, I'll go like a little bit underneath the eye, and that's where I'll start my line. I'll make these like half ovals with like the bottom being like boxy. Cause that's how you'll like see stuff from profile view.